snapshot into his worldview a little bit. Well, let's talk about the race issue, because really the meat of what I want to tell you tonight is how he evolves as a person, as a thinker on these matters of race. And I think shared a little bit about some of his views about race. They were pretty hardcore. You saw that from that lesson manual. They were so hardcore, as I mentioned, that they took chapters 15 and 16 out of the Portuguese edition of The Way to Perfection. The folks who did that, of course, who worked for the church, recognized how controversial his views were. Well, one of the things that starts to change Joseph Fielding Smith, and this is something that you learn from their diaries, is how policies affect people. It's easy to say that, oh, the ban prohibits Black people from attending the temple or being ordained to the priesthood. But it's quite another to see how these church leaders see how the policies affect people. And you see this with Spencer Kimball's diaries. You see it with Joseph Fielding Smith's diaries and other diaries of church leaders that I've read. And it has a profound effect on them when people come up to them at ward conferences in, say, Brazil, and they'll say something like, Brother Kimball, so this would be Spencer Kimball, Brother Kimball, I bear the curse. It pains me that I can't hold the priesthood. It pains me that I can't serve a mission. It pains me that I can't get married in the temple. And then Spencer Kimball would write in his diary, oh, I had this horrible thing happen today. I feel for this brother. I'm sympathetic to him. My heart goes out to him. And you really see that humanitarian side of these leaders. And in my book that will be out next year, I really, really tried to bring out that humanitarian impulse of how these policies affect real people. And one of the issues that affected Joseph Fielding Smith, one of the most, and not just Joseph Fielding, but others in the 12, was what are called biracial, we would say today biracial or mixed race Latter-day Saints. In those days, they called them a horrible term. They called them mulatto. When I say they, I mean just people in general, not just general authorities. Use the word mulatto, which we would never use today because it has such significant connotations. But what happened is that there were Latter-day Saints who had one drop of African blood in them. And they don't know what we know today about science, of course. Today, we know that if we go back at least, 200 years, roughly nine generations, 200 years, the scientists will tell us that each of us has African ancestry in our family tree. At least one African ancestor and one Native American ancestor. If we go back roughly 9 generations or 200 years. So this whole idea that there's a pure race to begin with it's just not accurate. And anyway, but of course, a lot of Americans at the time and people in the world didn't know that. And so the church followed what's called a one-drop rule, that if you had any kind of African ancestry, no matter how far back, that you would be cursed. And what's interesting about that is, forgive me for a moment for waxing professorial, but this is based on an idea that race is a construction. It's a legal construction devised by lawmakers in various states. So, for example, if you lived in Georgia in 1900, you might define a Negro as somebody who's 1/16. Or if you lived in South Carolina, they might say 1/8. And depending on the bar, you could be deemed black in one state and white in the next state. Because these are just legal constructions. Really, they're fractions is what they are. And so the church devised the one-drop rule, and that's what they discovered. Well, the hardest thing for the brethren to figure out is who bore the blood or curse. And you can see this picture right here. It's based on a book by a Stanford scholar named Allison Hobbs. And she wrote a book about it. She's not, of course, talking about Latter-day Saints, but she's just talking about how light-skinned people like this woman here, how they passed below the color line because they wanted upward mobility in society. They didn't want to go to a segregated Negro school. They didn't want to, live in a bad part of town. So they wanted to enjoy the privileges of citizenship by passing as white. Well, the church has this issue too, people who are of mixed descent, and they would frequently come to the brethren, and it was difficult because they looked white, but yet the church deemed them black. And one of the stories that really moved me the most in my research, and this is in the article that I published And it's also in the book that that'll be coming out, is the brother, and they call them part Negroes. What do you do with part Negroes? And the story is told of this man here, T. Edgar Lyon. Some of you, if you didn't join our call in time tonight, we were talking about him at the onset tonight. And T. Edgar Lyon taught Institute at the University of Utah for a number of years, from the 1930s until he was reassigned to a different position in 1962. And Edgar Lyon served as a mission president in Holland prior to his call. Actually, it was during his call as a church education system teacher. He took a leave of absence and became a mission president. Well, over in Holland, he met a white kid who discovered that he had African ancestry. And you can see from the top of my slide tonight that the boy's, this is Lyon telling the story now, the boy's great-grandfather had apparently gone to the West Indies and married a woman who was half Negro and half Indian. And now keep in mind what that means, that even though the boy is white, he's got blonde hair and blue eyes, the mere fact that he has a great-grandfather who married a half Negro and half Indian has now made this boy cursed. And so what's difficult about this story is that the boy was about to get married in the temple, and he had just realized by doing his genealogy that he had a cursed ancestral line, this great-grandfather of his. So now he's panicking. He's going to get married in the temple, and now he's recognizing, this is in the early 50s, I should tell you, he's recognizing that he can't do this. And what's further difficult is that this boy's, he had, I think, three brothers, one of whom was a bishop, one of whom was on the High Council, and the other one of whom was a stake president. So he's got three brothers that have significant priesthood responsibilities, and he recognizes that if he confesses, it will have a deleterious effect on his three older brothers. That is, it'll trigger a release from their callings. And so T. Edgar Lyon writes that this young man had three options. He could hide the information and go ahead and marry the girl in the temple. He could break off the engagement and tell her that he's cursed. And obviously she wouldn't marry him because she can't marry into a cursed lineage. Or three, they could tell the bishop, with the result that this brother will lose, the brothers, I should say, singular, would lose, or plural, would lose their priesthood, and it would invalidate their own temple marriages. And so T. Edgar Lyon went to a stake conference, and it was a Saturday session to the priesthood brethren, and Joseph Fielding Smith was the presiding authority. And he went over to Brother Smith before the meeting and he said, "Can I talk to you about something?" And Brother Smith said, "Yes." And he told him the story that I just shared with you. "Brother Smith, what should we do?" And without batting an eye, Brother Smith said, "Brother Lyon, you know what we should do. He's cursed. I'm so sorry, but he just bears the curse. You can't go forward with this. Instruct him to talk to his bishop." And obviously what that means is he wouldn't be able to marry the temple, and it would trigger a release for his brothers. Well, Lyon, who was very liberal on these issues, was not happy with that counsel, but probably not surprised, given Joseph Fielding's his history with these kinds of issues. And so he went back to his seat. The meeting began. They had the meeting, and after the meeting ended, Brother Smith sent word to Edgar Lyon to come visit him again at the podium. So he motioned him to come up, and in a moment of privacy, Joseph Fielding whispers in his ear, and he said, "I've had a change of mind." And Elder Smith said, "All of these men have been married in the temple, and they have participated in church ordinances. This disclosure would ruin their lives." Smith then told Lyon to tell the boy not to tell the circumstances either to his fiancée, the bishop, or anyone else. And then, of course, Smith said that, who are we to stand in the way if this is what the Lord wants? And when I read this story, I just thought, oh, wow, this is an extraordinary moment where he's telling him to, keep something really, really important to himself that could damage not just the young man, not just the brothers, but obviously the fiancée. And so as a historian, the way that I approach these things is, obviously I'm thinking about the human element to this that Brother Smith sees, but I'm also thinking about the context in which Brother Smith lives, which is to say that he's living during the 50s and 60s when he's presiding over the Quorum of the 12. He's going to be the next church president if he lives long enough when David O dies. And the civil rights era will impact Brother Smith greatly. I'll come back to the civil rights in just a second. Another experience is told by this man here. Some of you may know him. His name is Gene England. He was an extremely liberal professor at BYU. He started teaching at BYU in 1975, and he left BYU in, I think, 1998. He was kind of a controversial figure, which is to say he wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and he wasn't afraid to tell the church if they were being racist. And well, one day he met with Joseph Fielding Smith in the late 60s, and it took a lot of courage, really, for Eugene England to do this, because he was born, I think, I want to say the late 30s. And so he would have been in his early 30s at the time when he met with this aging apostle. And he basically told President Smith, he said, I just don't believe that the scriptures deny black people the priesthood. I just don't see that. And I'm sure that Gene England knew what Joseph Fielding would come back to, because he was never shy about writing his views in his books and how he interpreted the Pearl of Great Price, Abraham chapters 1 and 2, or, Genesis in the Bible, where it talks about a mark, not a curse, but a mark that a lot of Protestants and Latter-day Saints also interpreted to mean black skin. Well, anyway, so he goes in there and he talks to President Smith, and they went through the scriptures together. And Eugene England tells the story. He said that President Smith patiently went through the sources with me, and particularly the Pearl of Great Price. Then he said something quite remarkable. No, you don't have to believe that Negroes are denied the priesthood because of the preexistence. I can't imagine that Joseph Fielding Smith would ever say this to anybody, even a decade earlier. But by the latter decade of his life, he's definitely mellowing. And part of the mellowing is not just experiences dealing with the kid from Holland that I mentioned, who had blonde hair and blue eyes, but also with Latter-day Saints like Gene England, who were courageous enough to express in a very sincere way their views. President Smith was like a lot of leaders in the church, and that is they were really, really concerned about the civil rights movement. And what concerned them the most was that the critics would call attention to the church's race teachings, and particularly interracial marriage. That's something that the Brethren had felt strongly about. If you look at public opinion polls in the late 1950s, the vast majority of Americans don't support interracial marriage. And so the church, of course, is not unique in this instance. And some of you may know from your history that in 1967, the Supreme Court announced in a famous case called Loving v. Virginia, they had invalidated laws against interracial marriage. But anyway, the church has a vested interest in preventing interracial marriages because, of course, of the priesthood ban. So they're really worried about it. And a lot of Utahns in particular, including the ones on your left here, you see, these are members of the local Salt Lake City chapter of the NAACP. They're angry at the church for not supporting civil rights legislation on the state level. And there are two things that these folks really press the church leaders to support. One is that they want them to support an anti-discrimination law in housing, which is to say that they want to make it illegal for someone to say, oh, you're a Negro, we're not going to rent a house to you. They want to make that illegal. And they also want to make illegal an employer who says, I'm not going to hire you because you're a Negro. So they want the church to support an anti-discrimination law in employment. So housing and employment. And the church is in an interesting position because if they support civil rights, these two bills, they feel like they'll call attention to the church's race teachings. If they oppose it, they think they'll call attention to the church's race teachings. So they decide to adopt a policy of neutrality. Just don't say anything. And the NAACP, they're not, they're quite savvy. They understand that 90% of the lawmakers in Utah in the 1960s are LDS. And they understand that the church has to support these two seminal bills if they're going to pass. And so they meet with Hugh B. Brown and N. Eldon Tanner, the two counselors at the time. And in 1963, they have a meeting and they say, we're going to protest at General Conference if you don't support civil rights. So they're playing hardball with the church leadership. And Hugh B. Brown, who is very, very open and liberal on these issues, he supports civil rights all along, but he understands that some of his fellow brethren in the quorum don't. And so he's very sympathetic to their demands, but he understands that President McKay is the guy that has to make this call. So Hugh B. goes to President McKay and he says, look, they want us to support civil rights. If we don't, they're going to march and disrupt our conference. So this would be the fall of 1963. They're going to disrupt our conference. So President McKay tells Hugh B. Brown, he says, okay, you can produce a statement supporting civil rights, but incorporate it into your talk. Incorporate it into your talk. That way you give the impression that you speak for yourself and not the church. Well, Hugh B. mostly followed the rules, mostly followed the president's instructions. This is one time when he didn't. So he stood up at the pulpit and he welcomes the saints to the conference and he says, I have a statement I would like to read. And then after he read the statement, then he said, now I would like to begin my talk. And so he gave the impression, of course, that the statement was the first presidency statement as opposed to incorporating it into his talk. He did everything that President McKay asked him not to do. And Elder Kimball and some of the other brethren, they wrote in their diaries, President Brown gave the church a statement on civil rights today. I mean, they were totally blown away by this. They weren't expecting it. But it had the desired effect. They didn't march the NAACP because of the statement. But what happened with this statement was something interesting. It was just something like the church doesn't oppose civil rights. It said nothing about the employment or the housing bill. And so the NAACP members were not happy about it. And 2 years later, in March of 1965, they marched on Temple Square. And this march will affect Joseph Fielding Smith profoundly. You can see the sign in the background. You can see part of it anyway. It says, LDS leaders, use your influence for moral justice. And they're chanting around Temple Square. There's like 250 of them. They're yelling. The New York Times is there. The Washington Post is there. It's bringing a lot of publicity to church headquarters. And Joseph Fielding Smith and Spencer Kimball, they're looking at these marches and they're just flummoxed. They know it's not good publicity for the church, and yet they're not certain how to deal with it. So Joseph Fielding Smith, and I don't want to give him all the credit because it's not just him, but they decide to change positions, and the church is going to support an employment bill. And the minute the church lobbyists went up to the Hill and told the Latter-day Saint lawmakers that the church is behind this bill, it got passed just like that. And so in May of 1965, the first anti-discrimination bill in Utah was passed, protecting African Americans against discrimination in jobs. In the context of the 1960s, I shared this with you guys a little bit last time. Some of you may not have heard this part of a presentation I gave to this group last time. But anyway, there's a lot of protests going on at BYU. The church was under heavy fire for not admitting Black students to BYU. And the reason why they didn't admit Black students to BYU is because they were afraid of interracial marriage. And so a lot of universities decided that they were going to make a spectacle of the church's racial teachings by protesting at athletic events. And when I say protesting, I mean protests they did. Some of it turned violent. In Fort Collins, just a few hours to the north of me where I live in southern Colorado, it got so violent they threw you can see some of the black student activists, they threw a Molotov cocktail on the floor and it nearly exploded. They threw tire irons from the top of the bleachers that hit a reporter in the head and knocked him unconscious. I mean, it was really vicious and ugly. And this is the sort of thing that's going on in the late 60s. You can see here, there's a young black professor of sociology at San Jose State. His name is Harry Edwards. Some of you may remember in 1968, the 3 African-American athletes in Mexico City. Do you remember that? The Black Power salute. Some of you can remember that iconic picture that was in the news, that these 3 black Olympians, American Olympians, they won medals, and they wanted to make a political statement on the medal stand during the Olympics. Well, it was Harry Edwards that put them up to that. So this is what's going on. Edwards says that we're going after BYU, and if they don't change their ways, we'll close them up. I mean, this is really, really serious stuff. And Joseph Fielding Smith and Hugh Brown and others are really, really concerned about the image of the church throughout the late 1960s. BYU is also under investigation for alleged violations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This whole investigation dovetails these athletic riots. And Joseph Fielding Smith recognizes that the church needs to support civil rights. They have to do it. And Hugh Brown definitely is pushing for that as well. I think the biggest issue of President, here's a slide here, it talks about the brethren being really conscientious of the publicity the church is receiving. I love this one where Ernest Wilkinson says, the Board of Trustees, they were as cantankerous as hell. I mean, you can't get more unfiltered than that. This is during this investigation, this is during the protest. Brother Kimball writes, we had a rather stormy session of the board at the BYU. This is in early 1970. Anyway, one of the biggest things that Joseph Fielding Smith does is that during his presidency, he's not the president for very long. David O. McKay dies in January of 1970, and President Smith will take the realm in April of 1970 is when he's ordained the church president. Nobody thought he would be the president very long because he was just a year younger than President McKay. He's in his, I think, 93rd year. So he's slowing down cognitively. He's slowing down physically. And the people that the saints thought would be the church president is this man here. President McKay was the president for 2 decades. He was ordained in 1951 and he passed in 1970. So almost 2 decades. And it was just kind of anticipated in the church that Harold B. Lee would be like another David O. McKay. He was in his early 70s at the time. He was in relatively good health when he was called in to be the first counselor to President Smith. And a lot of the saints thought that he'd be the church president after Joseph Smith's short tenure as the prophet. Well, anyway, this is something that I'm just amazed that people don't know what I'm about to tell you. And I've shared this with some people that I purposely knew would want to know what I'm about to tell you. And what I'm about to tell you is not even in his authorized biography that it's an otherwise decent book, but Francis Gibbons wrote this in the early 90s, and just shocked that he didn't include this part. But President Smith was all of these instances with Black people and part Negroes, as they called them, and the civil rights movement, and all of these things were just sort of reaching crescendo during his presidency. And he felt that the church wasn't doing enough to help Black people. They weren't active. You know, the church never had a significant population of Black members because of the ban. But there were Black members in and around the Salt Lake area. There were, by some of the internal estimates the brethren had compiled, there were some 200 Black members in the Salt Lake Valley, and most of them were not active. And Joseph Fielding Smith had an idea that he wanted to resurrect. He first proposed this idea in 1955 to President McKay, and that is that he wanted to create a space for Black Latter-day Saints to worship. They could feel a sense of community. They could take the Lord's Supper together. Of course, that meant that a white priesthood holder would have to bless the sacrament and all of that. But the point was, it would be a support service for Black members. And it wasn't driven by a segregationist impulse that he didn't think Black people were good enough to worship with white people. None of that stuff. It was just that he thought that if Black people felt a community, that they would want to worship together. And so in 1955, he proposed this, and the timing could not have been worse. Emmett Till, a 15-year-old boy from Chicago, was just brutally murdered in Mississippi. And then a couple of months later, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus. And President McKay wisely told Joseph Fielding, he said, no, we can't do this. It will look bad. Your heart's in the right place, but it will look bad to the world at large if we create a segregated unit within the church. And I want to say just yet again, that was not his modus operandi. He didn't call it segregation. But to an outsider, that's how it would appear, that Black people would meet together once a month and worship. And it would send a signal to the world that they weren't, good enough to worship with white members. And I want to remind somebody of something that Dr. King was frequently critical about, the late, great Dr. King. He said that some of the worst segregated pews were done by white churches. And of course, Dr. King was always preaching racial harmony. Well, anyway, President McKay understood the optics wouldn't look good, and Joseph Fielding Smith accepted the counsel. Well, by 1972, when President Smith is the guy in charge, he resurrects this policy that he created 15 years earlier. And he told these three men here, he said that we've had some Black members meeting with us, Negroes, he called them. We've had these Negroes demanding to meet with me, and I know what they're after. They want the priesthood. We can't give them the priesthood, he said. But he said that I want you, and he's talking to Tom Monson, who had been an apostle, I think 1963, and Gordon Hinckley was fairly young too. 1961, he was called into the 12. Boyd Packer was recently called in the early 70s. And so he tells these three apostles, he says, I want you to go to these three Negroes, and I want you to tell them that we can will allow them to establish their own support group. And it'll be done with the authority of the church. Obviously, they can't hold the priesthood. We'll have to have supervision. But I want you to work with these brothers and instruct them that with this new worship service that we'll have at the end of every month, and that means also the Relief Society and primary and all of that, instruct them that we want them to reactivate the Negroes in their area. So Gordon Hinckley is the one that approaches these three Black men, and out of the blue, he tells this man here, Ruffin Bridgeforth, this man here, Darius Gray, and this man here, Eugene Orr, that the first presidency, authorized by President Smith, has allowed you to create your own group. What will you call it? Elder Hinckley says. And without batting an eye, these three men, whom I just named, who had been demanding to meet with the prophet, they said, we will call it the Genesis Group, for it signifies a new beginning. And so Ruffin Bridgeforth is ordained the president of the Genesis Group. His first counselor is one of my friends, Darius Gray. And then the third counselor is Eugene Orr. You can see Darius in his earlier years with his afro. You can see him on the right, kissing Brother Orr here. It's kind of funny. The gentleman here you see here is a guy named Don Harwell, who was the president of the Genesis Group in the early 2000s. He just passed away very recently. Gene Orr is still alive. Darius is still alive. Ruffin Bridgeforth died in the 1990s. And one of the things that I wish I had a picture of the presidency together. I had to sort of piece this together. I couldn't find a picture of the presidency early on. But what was interesting about this is that they definitely wanted the priesthood, and they demanded it. And in my research, I found some extraordinary things when they met with the three apostles, these three men here, Darius, Ruffin, and Gene Orr. they demanded the priesthood, and Gene Orr was like the firebrand of the group. He would not take no for an answer. He didn't understand some of the protocols of church culture, let's say, that you don't go into the apostles and demand. That's just not how it works in the church. So he was definitely the firecracker of the group. And he told the apostles when they met, and they were in Elder Hinckley's office, he said, quote, this is Gene Orr, "The cards were laid on the table and we demanded the priesthood, exclamation point." And Ruffin Bridgeforth was just the exact opposite. He was probably, I can't remember, maybe 15, 20 years Gene's senior. So he was like the elder statesman of the group. But he told them, he'd been a member since 1954. So he'd been in the church a while by the time the Genesis group was formed. And he told Gene Orr, he said, look, you've got to tone it down. You know, they've allowed us to have this Genesis group. You can't keep demanding the priesthood. You can't do it. And of course, I've interviewed Gene Orr. He's just as ambitious and sparkly as he was today as he was back then. I mean, even with me on the phone, we had a 3-hour phone call one time, and he was just animated as all get out, well into his 70s. He's a delightful man. Anyway, so he told Gene to tone it down, and of course, Gene didn't listen. And Darius Gray was somewhere in the middle. He was pulled in both directions. He understood the need to proceed with caution, but he also had, I like to say, a couple of the chromosomes of Gene Orr. I mean, he was pushing a little bit too. And so they demanded to meet. And one of the interesting things in the early meetings was 1971, where Elder Hinckley, when they met, they always met together. The 3 black men and the 3 apostles met together, and they met several times. And one of these meetings, they asked directly, you know, have you ever prayed about the ban? And the brethren were caught off guard. They'd never been asked that before. And so they said, no, we've never prayed as a 12 about the ban. And then they met again, and they were shocked. These black men were shocked that was the case. They never prayed about it. And about a month later, they met again, and the brethren had informed them that we've prayed about it since the last time we met. And the Lord said, not now. This is not the time to do that. And naturally, these 3 men were disappointed because they wanted the priesthood. But anyway, this is one of Joseph Fielding Smith's legacies, is that he was the first person to come up with the idea and subsequently authorize the Genesis group. And today, the Genesis group is not just in Salt Lake City; it's spread throughout the United States. I'm going to a couple more slides, and we'll wrap this up, and I'll take some questions if you have them. This is just in 2020. My friend Darius Gray here, you can see it's during COVID, the outbreak of COVID. They're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Genesis group. And again, this is I think one of the lost legacies of Joseph Fielding Smith. 2 slides I'll share with you as I conclude tonight is that in 2013, the church decided that they wanted to be subtle about it, but they recognized that as the church evolves and grows, that they needed a statement about Joseph Fielding Smith's writings on race, and also Bruce McConkie. Those 2 apostles were the 2 biggest purveyors of Mormon racial teachings, Mormon doctrine, and some of the books that President Smith had written. So really what you see here in this church statement that's on the church webpage this is verbatim, word for word. It says the church disavows the theories advanced that black skin is a sign of divine disfavor or curse, and that, any kind of action in the premortal life, they're just sort of pushing away from. These are definitely speaking to Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce McConkie. And so the church is evolving in many ways. And years ago, when I did a book on blacks in the church, this is the second book I've done on this topic. And I remember I met with a church PR person, and I said, I need a statement from the church about why Mormon doctrine went out of print. And the backstory is that some Black Latter-day Saints had been complaining about this book. That's the backstory. But I didn't want to make it personal. And so I told the church PR guy, wonderful man named Mike Otterson. And I said, Mike, I'm not here I just need a statement I can put in my book. And I said, I'll tell you what, I'll write it for you. And if you can get it approved for me, that would be great. And here's what I'll write. I'll say something like that Mormon doctrine no longer represented the values of the church. It was, produced in 1958 during a different racial climate. And today it's just some of its teachings are outdated on race. And Mike said, oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. So he said, understand that it has to go up to the 12 of the first presidency to get approved, and it might take a couple of months. I said, that's fine. So I went back to Colorado and I wrote up the 2 or 3 paragraph statement. I think he changed maybe 1 sentence or something. And then sure enough, 2 months later, it got approved. And the statement that I used in that book, and also this next book, reflects that conversation about Mormon doctrine no longer bearing the values of today's church. And let me conclude with this slide. In 2020, President Smith's legacy unfortunately popped up in a church lesson manual called Come Follow Me. And some dutiful people found this, and they, of course, recognized that it's offensive. And this is exactly the statement that you see that was in the quote. And once it was called to the attention of the powers that be, they removed the quote. And one of the apostles, gosh, I can't remember his name. I want to say Elder Cook, but it wasn't Elder Cook. But one of the apostles was speaking to the NAACP at convention just when this was going on. And he apologized at the convention for these racist teachings. That was an apostle. Really extraordinary admission. And I'm not certain how the NAACP would have interpreted that, right? They wouldn't have cared, probably. But anyway, it made the Salt Lake Tribune. You can see here, error printed in LDS Church Manual that could revive racial criticisms. And the church has definitely tried to evolve and be more inclusive in how it presents itself on matters of race. But anyway, Joseph Fielding Smith, let me just conclude with this thought, was an interesting person. He was multifaceted. He's not just that one-dimensional doctrinaire person that we think he is from his writings. When you start to read his diary and you start to really see him age, you really see a multidimensional person, someone who's evolving. And that's one of the reasons why I really grew to have great affection for him, is that I could see him evolve as a person. And that's something that, of course, I hope that we're all doing in our lives. We're evolving for the best. Thank you for your patience.
Patience was real easy to come by tonight, Matt. That was absolutely fascinating, gripping, wonderful. We really appreciate it. Somebody asked if we put in the chat the name of your book. I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but The Long-Awaited Day, Blacks, Latter-day Saints, and the Lifting of the Priesthood and Temple Ban, to be published by Oxford University Press. And we're all waiting and anxious to see your book. Any questions or comments from anyone here? My friend Gary London is with us tonight, and he told me a story years ago about watching the general authorities come to General Conference. Gary, would you mind repeating that, and maybe even your other one about the duet?
No, I just remember going to General Conference with a friend of mine. I think I was in my late teens, and it was a custom then, I don't know whether it still is, to go back behind it was the tabernacle then, so we went back behind the tabernacle to watch the general authorities exiting. And Jessie Evans Smith pulled up in a Volkswagen Beetle to pick up her husband. And the two of them then departed, smiling broadly and waving to the crowd as they left. A wonderful, gentle memory of the two of them. And I certainly concur with what Matt has said about Jessie Evans Smith's mellowing influence. And I hope I remember this experience correctly. I was attending a state conference in the Morgan, Utah state. And my recollection is, and I'm 90% certain that this is accurate, that Joseph actually joined Jessie in singing a duet in that conference meeting. Matt, I suppose that would be in his journal, in his diary somewhere. Have you come across it?
Not in his diary, but I have come across multiple instances in letters that he wrote where he and Jesse sang at different conferences. At first, he resisted her. He was kind of shy, didn't think he had a good singing voice. And we know who won the fight on that one because he sang with her. At one point, toward the end of his life, he sang with her quite often at various conferences.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you confirm that memory. And that, too, was a really lovely memory of the two of them. Unfortunately, I don't remember what they sang, but it was beautiful to watch the two of them sing together.
That prompts a memory of Sharon and mine, which was that she was a brand new member of the church then, coming down to visit me at BYU. And we went to I can't remember, I don't think it was General Conference. I think it was actually the spoken word.
Yeah.
And Jesse Evans Smith sang "He That Hath Clean Hands and a Pure Heart," which was sort of her theme song. And then afterwards, being anxious to have my fiance meet President Smith, we went to the front, and President Smith was very gracious in meeting Sharon and telling her she'd made a right decision on joining the church. But he was up there really cheering Jesse Evans Smith on as she sang this solo, which she sang frequently, I think, "He That Hath Clean Hands and a Pure Heart."
Nice.
I think I was at a BYU meeting, some in the Smith Field House or something like that, and he and Jesse were there, and he got up and said, "This is not a duet. Jesse says this is a do-it." And then they sang together, and I'm sure it was "He That Has Clean Hands and a Pure Heart." It was very touching, very warm. He appeared, it changed my ideas that maybe he wasn't quite the tyrant that he once was when I witnessed that.
I'm going to share a story, if I may, about that issue that is in his diary that I didn't share tonight. I'll be brief. So I mentioned briefly that David O. and Joseph Fielding, two men who had been in church leadership for decades. And so they had served in several council meetings together. They knew each other well. And they really had a rift in 1954 when David O. McKay sided with some of the CES people who didn't want to include this anti-evolution stuff in the church manuals. And it was a tough rift. Anyway, some of you might recall in the late 60s when David O. had called in some additional counselors, and he went to Joseph Fielding, who was by that point, I think 89, and he said, "I want to call you in as the third counselor." And both men just embraced and hugged each other. And as a historian and as a scholar, the way that I interpret that really fascinating moment is that was David O. McKay, the church president, sending an olive branch to Joseph Fielding by calling him in. Because Joseph Fielding thought he'd be the last person that President McKay would ever, make his counselor. But since they had some differences, some very strident differences of opinion over the years, that was President McKay saying, let's bury the hatchet.
Great. Other questions or comments by anybody?
I remember living through this period and kind of with fear and trepidation when we knew President Smith was going to become president of the church, and then commenting several times after that how much his presidency was pleasant and uncontroversial. Would you attribute that feeling or to his age or to his evolution?
Well, so let me say a word about Joseph Fielding and what people had thought about him. So I think most of the people on the call tonight know that how the church presidency works. It's the most senior apostle. It's not really a debate. You don't discuss it. It's just expected that the next church president will be the most senior apostle. And there were people in the 12 in particular who were worried about that because Joseph Fielding Smith was getting along in age, and he was sleeping through some church meetings. I mean, this is well documented. And they were worried that he didn't have the stamina to lead this church that was growing. Post-World War II, the church was growing globally. David O. McKay had this vision of globalizing the church, and certainly Spencer Kimball just, poof, blew that up even further. And Gordon Hinckley perhaps even further. But anyway, they were worried about Joseph Fielding Smith. And I mean, literally, they were worried that he could just could even stand at the pulpit and give a sermon. And so in April 1970, his first sermon as the newly ordained president, he made it through his talk. And Spencer Kimball writes in his diary, he said, we dodged, I'm paraphrasing, but we dodged a bullet. He gave the talk and all is good. But they were really worried that somehow something would happen where it would send the wrong message to the saints, that he wasn't up to a physical capacity. And Hugh B. Brown, who was kind of freewheeling in some respects, is among his many gifts, he was a great speaker, of course, but he didn't always like to follow church protocol. And so Hugh B. Brown thought that Harold Lee ought to just be the president rather than President Smith. And he was very adamant about it. And a lot of the brethren, of course, pushed back on President Brown, saying that's just not the protocol of the church. We can't do that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it wasn't so much that he mellowed publicly. It's so much that they knew that he wouldn't be around that long. And I think anyone who looks at President Smith's administration recognizes that the person in charge was Harold Lee. I mean, it was an open secret that President Lee was really the dominant voice in that administration.
Great response. Thank you.
I have a question. This is Gil Gould, and I put it in the chat. That I saw a bit on Jimmy Kimmel the other night where they stopped random people on the street, random white people. And as a joke, they asked them, they said, do you have a black friend? And most of them wanted to say yes. But when they were pressed, most could not name a black friend by both their first and last names. And it indicated that they really didn't have any black friends. And unfortunately, I think that's probably true of most white people, and probably true of most white people in the church. When I was working, I had lots of black acquaintances that I would interact with at work. But now that I'm retired, I really don't have any black friends. It's not that I don't want to have them, but it seems like this country is still under kind of a de facto segregation in so many ways. And I'm wondering if, after studying the question, what you think can be done in the church to change that situation. Like we don't even have any, we don't have any black members of our ward. I'm not sure how many black members of our stake we have. And anyway, I'm just kind of rambling on here, but there's a question in that, and I'm wondering if you can answer it.
Well, so the question is, as I understand it, what can the church do to invite more black members or convert more black people, maybe, or maybe there's a different part where what can we do as just people in our communities to associate more with black people? And I would say that we've got to be educated about what racism is, what it isn't. I think too many people, they look at racism as an iceberg, and they see the tip of the iceberg and they say, I'm not racist because I don't use the N-word. I don't belong to the Ku Klux Klan, stuff like that, right? I don't tell racist jokes. But then beneath the surface, they hold racist ideologies, when couple of years ago, when it's still going on, but when we had a wave of young black men getting shot by law enforcement, I'm not going to pretend for a moment that law enforcement is all bad, because we know that's not true. But like anything else in life, there are some bad apples, and so these young black men are getting killed disproportionate to white people, and so George Floyd's murdered, and when people say stuff like all lives matter, right? That's such a terribly offensive statement, because what it's really saying is I can't sympathize with a black young man who's been shot. And of course, any black person will tell you this, that of course all lives matter, but all lives can't matter until black lives matter. So that's the first comment I would say is to educate yourself about what it means to hold racist views or racist thoughts, and try to meet black people as much as you can. There are ways to do that, particularly if you live in a white community. It might be more difficult. but educate yourself by watching a podcast by a Black leader, a Black scholar, a Black theologian, a Black reverend. Go to a meeting of the local chapter of the NAACP. I think that's really, really critical. There's so many wonderful books out there on race and what it means to be Black, and read some of those books. In the church, as a scholar, I talk about this in my book, and that is how the church struggles with race today, because less than 3% of African Americans, so in this country, less than 3% are Mormons. So let me rephrase that. Black people comprise less than 3% of the membership of the church in the United States. That's not very good, right? Especially since the ban's been lifted, since 1978, and the church is still at less than 3%. And part of it has to do, if you talk to Black people, I mean, there are different opinions, of course. There's not one Black voice on this, but if you talk to a number of Black people, they will tell you that, gosh, I go into church and there's nothing representative of my tradition, right? Of maybe Black music or Black art. It's just a bunch of white people. And they're very clear on that. And I think one of the things that Mike Otterson told me, the church PR guy years ago, he said that, we've had some complaints about the lack of diversity in our art, our music, and he mentioned several things. And he said, we're really, really trying to fix that. And I know that the church recently, my mother just told me something interesting. She lives in Atlanta, Georgia. And she said that we have a beautiful painting of a Black woman, I think it's Jane Manning James, in the Atlanta Temple. And I know I just saw recently, I think in the church news, that there is a sculpting of the newly remodeled Washington, D.C. temple. There's a picture of I don't know if it's art or a sculpture, but nonetheless, it's a picture of a Black man ordaining his Black son to the priesthood. Those are the kinds of things that Black folk have been wanting for a long time. And thank goodness that the church is listening, and they're making the church more representative of the growth of this global church. So anyway, just to summarize, I would really, really encourage you to read literature and to look at podcasts and to start to familiarize yourself with some of these critical ideas.
Thank you.
Can I say something? I have been to Genesis many times, and they are wonderful meetings because everyone in the audience stands up, and they are automatically members of Genesis, whether you're white, Black. There's Black women who are married to white, and they've got their children there so that their children get together. There's one night, By the Way came. I have never seen so many Black teenagers together at once, and they were loving it. I'm sure you attended the Sterling McMurrin lecture given by Darius Gray, where the audience was poised to expect Darius to really come down on the church, and he was a prince of common sense, and I was really impressed with at the B1 celebration when Elder Oaks said, in 1978, the church instantly granted Blacks equality with the priesthood, but the membership did not. And we're still learning how to get together. So anyway, that's been I'm sure that you know Darius very well, and the role that he still plays in all of that sort of stuff.
Let me say a role or a word about this, and maybe Darius's work over the years. Darius is very circumspect in what he says publicly about his work behind the scenes, and so I'm not going to tell you anything that I shouldn't tell you. That's been privileged between conversations between the two of us. But one of the big issues of 1978 is that it didn't repudiate the doctrinal scaffolding for the priesthood ban. That is, if you read official declaration number 2, it says that all worthy male members can receive the priesthood. And of course, that's directed towards, African Americans. But it doesn't say anything about the curse of Cain, the less valiant stuff, interracial marriage. And so what happens is that in subsequent decades, Black Latter-day Saints, they write the Brethren and they say, this is stuff it's in my book, is that they want to know if they're still cursed. And I'm thinking of an example from a brother in California who wrote President Hinckley in 1995 is the first letter that he sent to him. And he said, I want to know if I'm still cursed. President Hinckley wrote him back and he said, don't worry about that, brother. You can go to the temple now. And the brother wrote back and he said, that's not what I asked. He said, I want to know if I'm still cursed. And President Hinckley didn't want to answer it. And the simple answer is I don't think President Hinckley believes that, knowing what I know about him at this point in his life. But he doesn't want to get into the business of repudiating some of the previous church officers, like Elder McConkie. And so he just sort of, dances around the issue. And then President Hinckley gave a talk, general conference talk, some of you may recall in 2006, where he talked about racism. And it was the first time that a church president had given a talk on anti-Black racism. And when I say anti-Black, I'm not talking about just, racism generally towards people of color. I'm talking about anti-Black racism. Darius had shared some things with President Hinckley that racism is so real that, and this is, I should tell you, Darius was president of the Genesis group. So Black members around the United States would call him and say, I can't believe I went to church on Sunday and some white brother just told me I'm cursed or that I was less valiant. How offensive is that, right? To think that your beautiful black skin is a sign of a divine curse. And anyway, so Darius said, President Hinckley, this is a huge problem. And I want to keep in mind something too, that Mormon doctrine is still circulating. You can still go to the store and buy it in the early 2000s. And so, of course, it perpetuates some of the teachings we're talking about. And Elder McConkie, to the day he died, he still talked about Black people being the sons of Cain. This is even well after, 1978. He talked about favored lineages, right? And all that means, meaning that white people are the house of Ephraim or the favored lineage over, non-Ephraim lineages. So anyway, Elder McConkie just had a hard time letting go of those teachings. But President Hinckley listened to Darius, and that's the context in which President Hinckley gave that 2006 General Conference address. And President Hinckley was not a fan of Mormon doctrine at all, but yet he didn't want to have it removed from print because he was afraid it might embarrass the McConkie family. And President Hinckley died in 2009. A year later, just months after he died, they removed Mormon doctrine from print. And in my opinion, that's the first time the church is really getting serious about cleaning up some of the theology that still remained after the priesthood revelation. And then in 2013, as I mentioned a minute ago, the end of my presentation, the church came out very specifically and repudiated the curse and the less valiant stuff. And I think that's such a seminal document because what that means is that if you hear a fellow Latter-day Saint preach that sort of thing, you can then go to the church's website and you can hold it up and say, look, that's not what the church teaches. Here is a document that's been approved by the apostles in the first presidency. So anyway, that was one of the unfulfilled, one of the outstanding issues that the Revelation didn't address. And then in 2013, the brethren finally addressed it.
Well, Matt, what a great presentation tonight. Just had us all sitting on the edge of our chairs, I'm sure. I speak for all of us in thanking you for your presentation, for your continuing studies. Just wonderful. Look forward to your book. Do what you can to expedite that process for us all, would you? Let me just tell you where we're going to go. And in a minute, I'm going to ask Marilyn Bentley if you'd be willing to give us a benediction. But before you do that, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our speaker next week. There are some surprises in this fireside program. We heard from Christine Hageland here several months ago, gave a wonderful presentation. I asked her, as I regularly do, if she had any recommendations for other people. And she said, well, yes, you should hear from my dad. And she told me a little bit about Richard Hageland. He holds a PhD in experimental nuclear physics with professional appointments at the Los Alamos National Laboratory and Vanderbilt University. And so I expected that would be the topic of his presentation when I asked him to give it. He completely blew me away, though, when he said he wants to talk about the office of a patriarch. And I think you may be surprised at what he has to say. I've given you a little bit of a preview, but I'm going to repeat it here. Listen to a couple of the phrases here that ought to grab your attention. He says, the Lord's promise to gather Israel with great mercies in the last days is reflected in his promise that in the ordinances of the Melchizedek priesthood, the powers of godliness would be manifest in the lives of the saints. Nothing better illustrates the reach of those mercies more than the patriarchal blessing, an ordinance which is not required for our salvation, but holds up to us individually the promise of his power. Since the earliest days of the church, the ordinance of the patriarchal blessing has included a declaration of the tribe in Israel through which blessings come to or exert the dominant spiritual influence on the recipient. And then this very tantalizing thought. If you have absorbed the conventional wisdom in the church about lineage in Israel, namely that it is primarily the family of Ephraim that has been gathered through the restoration, you may feel some cognitive disconnect if I tell you that since being ordained as a patriarch a dozen years ago, I have declared lineage in all the tribes. In this presentation, I will share what I have been taught about the gathering of Israel by seeing that every family in the house of Israel is represented in the membership of our state. So I guess that really kind of goes along with some of the things that you were suggesting, Matt, in the notion of preferred lineages, etc. So I invite you all to stay tuned, come back to us next week and listen to Dr. Richard Hageland speak about his experiences with being an ordained patriarch. Thanks again to all of you. Marilyn, we'd love to hear from you if you would give us a benediction now.
Thank you. Our Father in heaven, we are grateful this evening for the blessing we have had of gaining new insights and clarifications and expanding our thinking regarding all the peoples of the earth. We are so grateful for the scholarship, for the intense study that others have exerted to help us better understand and have a more complete picture of our history and of what we can do moving forward. We're grateful for the blessings of the gospel, for the way this helps us to find ways to share our love with all people, that we might lift and sustain others, and as well as bring depth and enrichment into our own lives, where we feel the effects of the gospel in every aspect of our lives. And we are grateful for this, for thy love for us and for all of our brothers and sisters, and say this gratefully in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you.
Brother Boundy?
Yes.
This is Lynette. It's Hagland.
Okay, sorry. Thanks. Good.
You'll know for next week. It's pronounced Hagland. He's in our state.
Oh, good. So you must be from Nashville, Tennessee yourself then, right?
Yes, sir. Uh-huh.
That's great. Okay, good.
I can't wait till next week. I love listening to him talk.
Oh, good. Well, wish you all a very pleasant Sabbath tomorrow. Good Sabbath to all of you. And thanks again to Matt Harris for a delightful evening. Thanks for sharing your time with us.
Yeah.
Ross, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So is Mike Grass scheduled?
I've written to him. I haven't heard back from him.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll see.
No, that's right. I'm waiting to hear from him. I'd love to hear from him.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I wrote to him about a week ago. I thought I sent you a copy of it.
I got a copy, and I wondered if he had.
No, I haven't heard back from him, unfortunately.
I will.
Keep all those suggestions coming in. I appreciate that very much.
We need a lecture. We need a lecture on the history of the temple veil. Now, have you been to the new endowment session?
I have, and I know what you're talking about. Quite an insightful experience, was it not?
Yes, but what's the history of that? Clear from Moses and before, clear to the present day. The significance of the veil.
Good thought. If you've got a nomination, we'd love to hear it. Yeah, I think the reference was to Hebrews, which was new to me. I wasn't aware of that.
The 10th chapter.
Is it that it is? Okay,
it's
good.
in the 10th chapter, but it was totally new to me.
Yeah, good.
So it makes you wonder what the significance was clear across time.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway.
David, that might be an assignment for you, David.
Oh, I'm probably not good at doing that one, but we might find somebody. I'll try to reach out to somebody.
Okay, good.
All right.
Thanks again. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Brother Harris. Thank you, Brother Harris. Very interesting.
Thank you for being here tonight.
Ross, can you hear me? This is Kent Price.
Hi, Kent. How are you?
Okay, I didn't know if I had this thing turned on or not. I got on late, but thanks for the invitation and look forward to seeing you again.
You bet.
Could you hear me?
I did. I heard you.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Vielen Dank, Herr Bounty.
Ja, ebenfalls. Danke.
Ja, guten Abend.
Guten Abend.